皆様、本日は日曜日の朝にもかかわらず、エデュケーションビヨンドが主催するウェビナー、いわゆるギフテッドの子育てに参加いただき大変ありがとうございます。私、本日司会を務めます、一般社団法人エデュケーションビヨンドの服部彩子と申します。どうぞよろしくお願いします。まず、本日のプログラムのご案内です。この後、当団体の概要説明に引き続き、米国ジョンズ・ホプキンズ大学のセンター・フォア・タレンテッド・ユース CTY より、エグゼクティブディレクターのエイミー・シェルトン博士から、うちの子は特定のことに強い関心を示す、そう思ったら、いわゆるギフテッドの子育てと題した講演があります。講演の後9時30分頃から20分から25分にわたって質疑応答を予定しています。皆様からの質問は、Zoom の Q&A 機能で随時受け付けています。質問がある方は、Zoom の Q&A 機能にご記入ください。時間の許す限り、できるだけ多くの質問にシェルトン博士に答えていただきます。その後、今後予定している同団体が主催するプログラムについてご説明します。応募や選考、費用など詳しい内容になっております。また、ウェビナーは日英の2カ国語で行っています。Zoom の下の方にある地球儀のマークから、日本語で聞きたい場合は日本語、英語で聞きたい場合は英語を選択してください。それではまず私から簡単に当団体について説明します。エデュケーションビヨンドは2020年の7月に設立。2022年1月から本格的に活動を始めました。現在およそ30名のボランティアメンバーが事業開発、マーケティング、IT、会計、法務、人事などの専門的なスキルを持ち寄って日々の事業運営を行っています。法人のミッションですが、知能が高く学校の一斉授業では物足りない知的好奇心が旺盛な子どもたち、いわゆるギフテッドとも呼ばれている子どもたちが自分の可能性を最大化できる社会の実現を掲げています。このミッションの実現のためのビジョンは3つです。こうした子どもたちが学びへの欲求を満たせる場の創出。2つ目は、子どもたちの保護者が情報を交換できるコミュニティ、場の形成。そして3つ目は、子どもたちを理解した教育方法を模索している学校の先生の皆さんと現場で一緒により良い対応を考えていけないか。この3つを掲げています。2024年度は、こうした子どもたちに向けて自由研究を行うプログラムを年間を通して開催する試みをスタートしました。また、長野県など地方自治体との取り組みも行いました。今後は今日講演するエイミーさんが所属する CTY と一緒に新しいプログラムを始める予定です。講演の後に今年開催する予定のプログラムについて紹介します。では皆様お待たせいたしました。講演を始めます。米国ジョンズ・ホプキンズ大学センター・フォア・タレンテッド・ユースエグゼクティブディレクターのエイミー・シェルトン博士より、うちの子は特定のことに強い関心を示す。そう思ったら、いわゆるギフテッドの子育てと題しての講演です。エイミーさんよろしくお願いします。Good morning, Amy, and would you please talk about my child is academically advanced. Now what? Please.
Yes, give me just a moment. Thank you. Thank you for that welcome. And I'm excited to be here to talk with you a little bit about, as you said, the topic, my child is academically advanced, now what? And when we talk about this, one of the things we started with is just getting people to think about the questions that they have. So what does it mean to you right now? What questions do you have about supporting your child? And what kinds of things should you do to support your child? And there's a whole long list of answers to that last question. So I'm going to break it down a little bit by talking first about just briefly about what we hear when we talk about the goals of education. And if you look up the goals of education across many different countries and systems, you often hear statements like these. So the goal of education is to prepare students for success in their future endeavors, or to promote student achievement and preparation for global competitiveness by fostering educational excellence and ensuring equal access. These don't really tell you what to do, though. These provide sort of a framing of it. And what we would argue is that if we want to think about how we work with kids, we have to make a start. And this is true for all children, but we're going to talk a little about what it means for advanced learners. But it's really to make sure every child learns something new every day. And the reason we say that is when we think about a typical standards-based approach to education, meaning that we try to sort of see our kids doing what we want them to do, our students succeeding, we tend to see students sort of categorized into roughly two levels. That is, those that are not performing well enough and those that are. And oftentimes this is necessary for schools to sort of know where they're having potential problems. But there can be an underlying problem here. So let's imagine in this group of students that this student is actually an advanced learner. And there may be more, but let's start with just this student who may be showing up in this category of what we consider to be fine. They're performing at or above the level that's required for them in school. Well, there's concerns about what happens with this child. The first thing that can happen is an under-challenged student may actually find their own way. They may actually succeed. They may figure out ways to support their education. But there are other things that happen as well. So in this case, they are driven by curiosity and they will often find their own learning. But this is heavily dependent on having the resources and the emotional traits. So when we talk about a school not necessarily noticing a child, this supports and traits are really important. The other thing that can happen, though, is that they can lose interest and severely underachieve. So a lot of what I'm going to talk with you about and some of the tips are about not losing interest so that a child can continue. These students can act out and become problem students. This is very, very common in the United States, where a student who is underachieving will sometimes become a behavioral problem. Or they may coast along and do what we say appear okay, meaning that they look like they're fine by our standards, but they're actually underachieving. And it's really this student that is hardest for us to identify because they may look like they're fine in school, but in fact, the long-term outcomes are not good. So this gets back to that idea of really what we want to do is make sure every child learns something new every day. And that extends beyond school. So now we have this notion of these sets of students that we've called sort of fine or not fine, but an underachiever is also not fine because, as I said, their long-term impact tends to be negative, that this is someone who could actually fall off and not reach their potential. So what do we need to do? Well, first, we need to sort of seek solutions to this. And schools vary quite a bit in their willingness to support these students, but also in their capacity. So the first thing I want to say to any parent is there are some things you can do on that front. And first is to be informed about what the options are. And again, this is going to vary a lot by school, by region, by where you are. But we always say that you can find out what's actually possible at schools. So in the United States, we often look at things like whether or not they'll develop individual learning plans for students, or are there activities that are either being put into the classroom or activities where a child can be pulled out of a classroom, whether this is during the school day or after school. Are there things that are happening? The second thing in terms of getting informed is to educate yourself. There's a lot of literature that is sort of about advanced learners, but it often isn't focused on the student needs. And when we talk about this sort of evolving space, we really start to talk about is what students need. And I would urge people to also know that there are the common myths around these students. Myths such as they will just be fine if you let them go. They're smart, they'll be fine. But also things like that these students are across the board emotionally in a particular category, when in fact, socially and emotionally, these kids follow the normal distribution like any other children do. So understanding kind of what we know about these kids is helpful. And then we urge people to consider out-of-school programs. There are others, not just CTY, but others as well, and these can be in person or online. This way you know sort of what your options are. But what I want to talk about tonight is what you can actually do. So beyond these are about getting informed and finding things for your child. But what can you actually do? And so I'm going to start with, I have 5 tips and then 5 tools. So the tips are more about things to think about, and the tools are about things you can do. And I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. So first, I'm going to talk about fostering curiosity. When we talk about this, it seems like kids are naturally curious, and advanced learners tend to be off the charts on this when they're listened to and when their interests are catered to. And so what we always tell parents is one tip is just to listen for clues to what's interesting to your child. So whether it's projects or topics from school, things they talk about that they're seeing in the media, particular experiences that seem to really grab their attention. Paying attention to that beyond just the academic interest is really important to foster curiosity. And this allows you then to ask questions and encourage follow-up. And that's where we'll talk a little bit more about the tools, is how do you follow up? It should be pointed out that children actually are natural explorers, and oftentimes it appears that the way we structure their world sometimes hampers that and sometimes reduces that tendency because they're not rewarded for being natural explorers. So fostering curiosity is one way to do that. So here's an example, a simple example from our world that when we talk about fostering curiosity, it would not be uncommon for a child in Baltimore where we are located to ask, how are the Orioles doing? So how is our baseball team doing at any given summer? And it's highly variable from year to year. But rather than simply answering that question, which many parents here would be able to do, instead you foster curiosity by asking the child to look something up, to work with them to sort of find some information and think about it. So very simple things like just resisting the urge to answer and providing a place for a child to ask their questions more deeply. The second tip is a hard one for all of us, and that is to allow failure. And the rationale behind this is that where learning happens for complex concepts is really in the mistakes and the errors. So instant success actually limits learning for complex concepts. So taking just a simple version of that, imagine I'm making a paper airplane. If I make a paper airplane, I fold it and I use some things I think might work, and I throw that airplane and it flies beautifully. I have learned very little. I will not know very much about what's actually happening. However, if my plane doesn't fly so well, and I have to make new ones, and I have to try different things and try different wing designs and different weights, and I get to the point where I get a really good one, I've learned a lot about why. I've been able to try different things and know why it flies well, not just that it can fly well. And that's true for many things that we do. It's sort of an engineering design approach to saying this is actually how we learn. And so the other piece to this is that we're not good at this. We're not good at failure. We think of it as truly a negative when in fact it is a part of learning. So we have to learn how to learn from our own mistakes and failures. We have to be deliberate in saying, okay, this is part of the process, and try new things that do cause us to fail in order to learn from them. So the key then is that children need to be given permission to fail as part of the process of learning. You need to create spaces where they are able to try things that they cannot do on a first try so that they can learn from them. And the key then is to not allow them to give up. So making it a positive experience rather than a negative. Now, as an educator and as a parent, I know there are moments where something that we would call a failure is, a big challenge to you and is devastating and difficult to recover from. But the recovery is always possible. And this tip about allowing failure is more about creating situations where failure is permitted and encouraged and becomes a key part of the learning. The third tip is one that I love to tell parents, and that is be a student. Learn right alongside your student. Learn from your student. Being engaged with your student is a way to show them that you value their interests, you value their curiosity, even when a school might not. So again, if we go back to the example of our baseball team, and we're now looking up and saying, oh, the Orioles, how are the Orioles doing? And if you're working with a young child, they may look at this and say, I don't know. I mean, we can say, oh, this is the ranking in their part of the league. but how do we know what these numbers are? And a child might ask a question like, well, what is this PCT column? And from that, that's an opportunity to test some things out. Rather than just looking it up, you can play around with it and ask things like, well, it looks like the rank depends on this. So I wonder if it could be something about the number of wins. Maybe it's the percent wins. And that allows you then to do things like, well, let's play with it. We've got the wins and losses here. Let's calculate that. Let's see what happens and see if, in fact, it matches up. Now, if I were taking my own advice, I would have actually done this wrong the first time. So I could say, well, no, that's not it, and learn from the failure. But in the interest of time, I wanted to show you just the straightforward version of this. And the key to being a student with your student is that there's no expertise needed. It's okay to say, I don't know. It's an opportunity to say, let's both learn something. And oftentimes you'll find that your student, your child, knows more than you do about a lot of topics. The fourth tip is to talk to other families. I cannot tell you the number of times parents have been connected to each other, or caregivers have been connected to each other, and have said that was sort of the magic moment where I realized, one, I'm not alone, and two, I can understand what's happening. So you can ask questions like, what opportunities or tips or ideas have other people found? And what experience have their children had? Now, I will say, sometimes people say, but if their child had a bad experience, does that mean my child will? No, your children may be different. And in fact, what you have to do is understand, learn from each other what the rationale is for doing certain experiences and why their child might not have liked it. So I remember one time I was talking to a parent who said, oh, this one opportunity after school did not work for her child because it was so sciencey. It was like being in forensics, doing these experiments. Well, that's exactly the kind of thing that some kids would love. And so just listening and knowing and learning what the experience was like guided other parents to it. Or you can find out that, in fact, it's not a great experience and you don't necessarily want to try it, but it's a way of building resources. And to do this, you're then creating support networks. And this then provides that venue of you're not alone in this space. You can learn from each other as well as from expert sources. And we actually have a very active CTY parent group. It is not about advertising CTY. It's actually a place where parents come together. Sometimes they do speak about CTY, but oftentimes they just come there with questions and ideas and thoughts about their children as well. And so that is another place of sharing. And then the fifth tip is one that's tough, especially at this time where we have a lot of literature on the challenges of screen time. But the fifth tip is that we need to embrace the internet. And going forward, this tip is probably going to emerge into we're going to have to embrace artificial intelligence as well. I will say concerns about children and screen time, how much time they're on their phone or on the computer, all of those screens, those concerns are very real. There is evidence that we have to be careful about that time. But access to content, the ability to learn beyond what we can do, in our interactions day to day, it's never been this easy. There are abundant resources for parents and for students. And the key to embracing the internet is knowing the sources you're coming from. And that's where bringing in expertise can be helpful. But the key to the internet is to make that screen time valuable in important ways. And some of the things we talk about that kids can do, like fostering curiosity and learning about things, this is where they're learning. So those are the 5 tips. What I want to then talk about briefly are the 5 tools. So these are similar in a lot of ways. And some of these, like the tips, may seem like sort of common sense. But let's talk a little bit about things that families and educators can do. What are the actual tools that you can use to advance your child? And the first one's kind of a fun one, because one of the first tools you have at your disposal is your students, is your child. So kids are notorious for finding the things that interest them. And that can be something from bringing activities from school home, so allowing students to kind of show you what they learned, helping them to connect home life with school, so finding the relevance of the things they're doing in school. And the other half of that is empowering students to find opportunities. So whereas we just talked about one of the tips is talk to other parents, your child is also someone who can find opportunities. So really listen to your child's suggestions and urge them to explore possibilities with you. The second tool, now we're going to get into some that take a little more effort, is what we call the Mythbuster approach. And this is a tool you can use to take a child's curiosity and work through it with them. And the key is that first thing is you listen for facts and ideas in the media. This can be news stories. It can also be fictional things like films or TV series or books that they're reading. Those things can be springboards for generating interesting questions. And so looking at those as a way to say, why? Why is something happening here? For example, for those who might be familiar with the Disney movie Finding Nemo, the fish Dory has some memory problems. And as someone who has studied memory as part of my research career, I got the question, how true to life are Dory's memory problems? Well, that is a fantastic question, and you can pursue it. You can do it by looking up evidence. So what's supported and what's not. And then ultimately decide between what's fact and what's fiction. So let me walk you through an example of that. So I'm going to take a factual one from the news. So a while back, school start time is a very important question, particularly for teenage students, because of what we know about their biology and the fact that they often don't get enough sleep. And so there was a news story on school start time saying that starting early was associated with poor academic performance, so poor outcomes, poor attendance, higher rates of accident and injury. And I was working with a group of kids at that time, and they were very interested in this question. So we said, well, let's look it up. Let's see if we can find a scientific basis. Well, it turns out that they provided a source right here on the news story. So we were able to go and find it and look up what they talked about. And what they talked about was that there is evidence that sleep is critical learning, and that they then inferred some causality from other sleep studies. So we were able to look at some of the studies that they actually talked about, get some information on them. And what we found was that this was a story that was based on things we do know. We do know that a lack of sleep has adverse effects on people. And we know that an early start for teenagers will mean a lack of sleep, because it's very hard to adjust when the biological clocks themselves are adjusting. And so this story took those two things and put them together to say that early start times would have adverse effects. So what we concluded then in this myth-busting approach was this was mostly true, that this was based in evidence. And while it required some multi-step inferencing, the kids could determine that, yes, this was a legitimate story, and they were very interested in the potential outcomes. A third tool is similar in a lot of ways, and that is projects, creating a project-based space. And what this really means is finding a topic of interest, and again, usually driven by your child's talking about their school and other things, and then dig into it, whether it's through research or through experiences, but figure out how to learn about the topic of interest. And then to make it a project, you encourage organizing the new knowledge that is obtained. This can be what we call an age-appropriate product. That could be, if they're older, they might want to write something. They might want to write a story. They might want to make a map or a model. My son was very big into PowerPoint presentations, and allow them then to present to you if they're willing to. So examples that we might think of in terms of things that would lead to interesting projects are things like, imagine that you get the comment or question, why does Japan have so many earthquakes? This is a rich area for thinking about what's going on that would lead to that kind of an event. And a child can not only learn about Japan and its topology and its weather patterns, can also learn about earthquakes in general and other things that go on in the world. So that would be the kind of thing. If you're planning a trip, so one time I was going to Kazakhstan for work, and my son got very interested when he started asking me questions. Instead of answering his questions, I asked him if he would help me plan my trip, and he provided me with a PowerPoint presentation on Kazakhstan that actually had more information than the briefing I got from my own international team at CTY for the trip. So it was a really great opportunity for him to learn something about something very new to both of us, and share that with me. It can be things like traveler weekend experiences. It can be topics in school. So I once had a neighbor who was coming home from school when I happened to be outside with her mother. And she said, oh, we heard that birds build different kinds of nests. And so we started to ask her about what kind and what they were. And she seemed like, oh, I don't really remember, wasn't really interested. Well, her mom was very creative and clever. And she said, could you build me one or two of these nests? And so her mother got out some materials. It was clay and Play-Doh and some other things. And the little girl then built a couple different nests. Well, having her build those nests, she then started explaining to us what they had learned, that the birds build different nests for different reasons because of their characteristics. So it was a way of springboarding into getting more knowledge out of the situation and helping her solidify the interesting thing that she found in school. The fourth tool is home experiments. These are a bit for the daring because they can be messy. And there are a couple different ways to think about these. There are many kits out there that you can purchase. There are academically oriented clubs that bring some of this into the home. And if you're interested in sort of seeing some of these in action, a simple search will get you a wealth of ideas on the web. There are all kinds of experiments. I will say they vary in the degree of messiness, so it depends on how brave you are. And some are short-term, some are long-term. But there are many, many things if your child is interested. And not all of them are strictly in sort of the biological realm. There's a whole range of things that you can try out with kids. So if a child's interested, this is a great way to kind of see what they're interested in too, because they're often fairly low commitment. And so they're very often very easy resources to try out. And you can start to explore your child's interests with them. So here's just a simple example of an at-home experiment. These are what we call the curiosity-driven experiments, where someone asks a question and you pursue it. So rather than purchasing something in advance, it's answering a question. And so a child might ask something like, well, what makes things float? That's actually a great question. And many of us know the answers to those things. But it allows you to sort of ask them questions. Well, what kinds of things do you know float? Or what properties do they share? My son once asked, are they waterproof? Which I thought was a fantastic question. And then you can do things like, does shape matter? And then take that information and create an experiment. And so this is one that, again, you gotta get the space get a little wet, but you can do something as simple as this. So we just took 2 balls of clay and created 2 different shapes out of them, and then created 2 bowls of water and just compared. So these 2 things started out as the exact same material, but with different shapes. And you're able to start to evaluate why one works or one does not. And you can see pretty quickly that the second one does actually start to sink. Not the best designed boat. But it gave an opportunity to really think about why things float. He also then looked at things like how much water each of these displaced when they were floating versus sinking. So this was an opportunity just, again, to do some at-home experimentation. I did not necessarily have to know much about sort of displacement and what kinds of materials are waterproof in order to do this. I was able to bring some knowledge. I have the same lay knowledge as a typical adult, but I didn't have to know the details in order to play around with these things. Then we actually looked up some of the terminology. And then the 5th tool. So we've got some experience stuff. The 5th tool is a pretty broad one, which is making play educational or doing educational play. And this is a pretty easy one, but it has to be a little bit deliberate. And that is find experiences that scaffold and reinforce learning. And it can be almost anything. The things we most often think of are things like games, puzzles, blocks, anything that lets you build. Everyday objects can become educational toys for storytelling and all kinds of things. There are all kinds of toys out there that fit this bill. To make it educational, you have to really think about how you're choosing. And the choice needs to be based on both the interest of your child and things that are going to challenge them to be more difficult. That doesn't mean you should never let your child play with something that is sort of easy for them and fun for them. You want to keep that engagement, but if you can up that difficulty level, give it something that has a challenge, that then turns that play into educational play. And really, this is a lot of trial and error. The number of times I have purchased a gift for a child that I thought was going to be challenging and then find that it was just not hard enough, usually because they were an advanced learner. So there is some trial and error to this, but it is really kind of things that are fun and then can also sort of push that difficulty. I cannot emphasize enough, though, the importance of knowing a child's interests, because if you don't do things that are interesting at the onset, it's not going to have the learning benefits. And sometimes you have to explore those interests. You have to find out what they're interested in. So again, a little bit of trial and error. And then along with this, I strongly encourage parents and educators to join in the fun because we actually know from a wealth of data that play is actually good for all ages. It helps our creativity. It is a way of sort of helping us get past blocks in thinking. So many writers will talk about what they do to get rid of writer's block. I would say the same thing with any idea block. Anytime you're trying to problem solve, play can be a wonderful way to both learn about things and sort of get that cathartic kind of feeling of, that positive feeling going. So if we're going to encourage play in children, we should encourage play in adults as well. It's a great way for us to learn as well. So those are our 5 tips and our 5 tools, and any one of these can be expanded on. And in fact, we have some upcoming webinars at CTY that will expand on a few of these. So each one of these, I could go into much greater detail, and all of these have behind them some literature that supports why we actually put these forward as tips and tools. But with that, I will say that hopefully this gives you some ideas about things that you can do. And I'm happy to sort of summarize for you what we hope you're getting out of this. So I hope what you're saying is that student success starts with being interested and engaged. As I said about play, if they're not interested, if you can't keep them engaged, the learning will not be as successful. Lots of outcomes in school, we think about them having to be dependent on the material, but so much of it is about engagement. There are multiple ways to encourage learning outside of school. I've given you a set of some that we've talked about, but I'm sure you can think of ways as well. And the tools can be simple everyday activities. The key is to look for things that can challenge and engage and foster that curiosity in your child. You just have to add a little direction and encouragement to do that. So it's taking what we already know to be good sort of fun things for kids and sort of making it deliberate, really thinking about what they're getting out of it. And with that, I will say, let's see if I can, arigato gozaimasu. I think that's probably close, but I apologize for butchering your language, but thank you so much for listening and for learning, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Amy. It was very understanding and was lots of learning. And we have lots of questions from our audience.
Excellent.
So we now move on to Q&A sessions.
Certainly.
では、これから質疑応答に移ります。まずは一つ目の、質問ですが、どのような環境で育てたら強みを伸ばすことができるのでしょうかという質問になります。So please answer.
Okay, so I thought about this one because when we talk about settings, we tend to think about, so almost any setting can become a good learning environment with the right sort of thinking behind it. What I would say is that if we're going to talk about things like curiosity and the permission to fail, an environment needs to be structured in a way that is very supportive and that it allows for some exploration and daring. So almost anything you do can turn into a learning experience, provided you're willing to offer that sort of supporting space. As we say, that permission to fail, that ability to do things, to try things that are new and try things that are hard, and it's okay to not always get it right the first time. Creating that kind of sense of safety is really challenging in education. And so it really does come down to thinking about the way you respond to your child. So creating that sense of it's very supportive. It's supportive not in a sort of wrap around and don't let things happen, but supportive in saying like, yes, let's get out there. I've got your back is what I always say, that parents should be more of a safety net for their child, but not necessarily sort of there to do all of the things you can do. Let them do the work, but be there to be supportive and to be behind them. So really creating, like I said, that secure and safe environment.
So maybe this is not only for advanced learners, but for all child.
It is really for all children. Yes, yes. But advanced learners in particular, because they are the ones that really do tend to be afraid to try something new that they might not be good at. We see a lot of that. Not always, but a lot of that.
Okay, thank you. And では、2つ目の質問になります。私の娘はアートと水泳と生物を得意領域としています。 日本のギフテッドは必要な支援を得ることができず、服薬しながら義務教育を受けている状況ですと。国としてギフテッド支援は40年かかると言っています。親として、教育機関にどのように話して、どのように行動すればよいでしょうかという質問です。
Okay, so this is stuff we talk a lot about advocacy and what parents can do. And I think part of the issue here is to start to form some common bonds with other parents. There's more power in numbers among parents. And so that's just a start. But I would say that the thing that you need to focus on for advocacy, particularly in a setting where this is not likely to be supported right away, is to think about it from the standpoint of student needs, is to create a narrative around this is something they need. We talk a lot about these things, and I can provide, I'd be happy to provide some resources on how we talk about these things, but creating a very clear case for this isn't about giving an advantage. This is about preventing students from not achieving, from not meeting their potential. And we see this as a very serious challenge for future problem solving, right? We want all kids to succeed. This is not about these kids succeeding and others not. It's that all children should. And if you don't attend to their needs, they won't. And so it's really important. And I say, pulling people together, providing a case, really thinking about it from a needs basis, takes it away from the idea that this is just me as a parent trying to help my kid, my child, right? I want to help. I want to advance children in general, and this is one population. And again, we can provide some additional resources around that. We deal with this an awful lot in working with school districts and schools.
Thank you. We have lots of questions, so we move on to the next one. 3つ目は、私の高校生の息子は数学、科学、歴史が得意です。将来の進路について何に重点を置くべきかと私に尋ねてきます。これらの教科に幅広く興味を持っている彼に一つの分野に絞らせるにはどうしたらいいでしょうかという質問ですが、一つに絞らせた方がいいんでしょうかね、これは。
So what I would say, so I'm going to switch hats just a little bit because I think behind this is some of the college advising. So first I would say actually fostering the broad interests is not a bad thing. We need more and more people who can think in interdisciplinary ways. And I think there's a lot of worry that we force children in particular to specialize too early. And when you have someone who can be successful across fields, it's important to foster those because over time it will start to sort into things that you can do. Now, what I will say is that when it comes to advice, if you're thinking about it both in terms of foster and encourage those broad interests, because it will help, being interdisciplinary does help. It is also important, though, particularly by high school, that kids do have at least some things, like, something that they've shown a strong commitment to. It doesn't have to be a career field. It has to be an interest, and it has to be something that they show they can do the work in. But this is a great combination as well. Math, science, and history, there are so many amazing people who work in spaces where bringing those things together can be very valuable. So I think finding ways to introduce students to careers, this is something we're actually encouraging schools to do, is introducing some opportunities to see that careers aren't necessarily about single fields anymore either. It's about, are there spaces to bring them together? So in the interest of time, I don't think I can give specifics for this, this combination, but I would say encourage those broad interests, but also help your child find some things, some pathway to show a sort of a high level commitment to going deep into a topic. And it may be actually a combined topic. So things like, looking at the history, and there's so much on the history of science that helps us think about how science is going to move forward. And you need to know those things very well. So trying to think about how those things come together is probably the best bet here.
Okay, thank you. そして、ここにも今の会場から来ている質問もありますので、そちらも聞いてみましょう。12歳で学校では問題児ですと。 好奇心が刺激されないために意欲が低下していることを学校に伝えているのですが、チャレンジをさせてくれるのではなく、問題行動の指摘をするばかりで、さらに意欲が損なわれる悪循環に陥っています。学校にどのような説明あるいは提案をすれば、この悪循環を止められるでしょうかという質問になります。こちら今映っているスライドの質問ではなく、学校とのコミュニケーションがうまくいかないという質問なんですが、どのように学校と付き合っていけばいいでしょうか。
Yeah, so schools can be tough, and I'd need to know more about the school itself. I actually just had a very similar case of a very young child here in the United States where the parents were expressing the same thing. My child is starting to get in trouble. He's losing interest in school, and the school won't do anything about it. I will say that is a case where we say you may need to do supports outside of the school. Again, I think what you need is evidence to bring to the school. So there are ways to do things like get and I don't know how easy this is. I'd have to look into resources in Japan, but we do things like encourage families to get some expert opinion outside of the school to help guide that. So I know people ask often about taking, getting an assessment with the WISC or other tools. That is something we would encourage, especially if they're younger, that if your child is losing interest, you need some evidence for the fact that this is due to their academic needs. So we do a lot of the testing for our programs, and oftentimes that is a tool that we will say to a school, look, this child has been tested and is above grade level. I cannot promise a school will listen, but if you're armed with that information, you can then think about, are there things you can wrap around? So some of the things we talked about tonight are ways to help a student who isn't getting what they need from school as well. So yeah, we do a lot of consulting on these kinds of things, and it's always challenging because we never know what a school is going to be willing to do. This is also a safety in numbers moment. You might want to find other parents in your school who feel similarly. Are there other parents who feel their kids are under challenged? And can you work together to say this is a very real set of students who are going to drop off. They're not going to be as successful as they could be.
研究だから、無理にその学校で何とかしようとするわけではなく、その学校の外にいろいろなリソースとか助けてくれるところを求める方がいいということですよね。
Yes, yes. So here in the US, we would send someone to get what we'd consider educational testing, and that can be a light lift, or it can be big, depending on the particular, there are different options. But getting some evidence that you can say an expert has agreed with me that my child needs more academic support. That is at least tends to be an opening for most schools, because now they have to ignore evidence that the child needs more.
Thank you. So we may have time for another one more question. 得意な才能のある子供とのコミュニケーションの仕方についてですと、子供の特性について学校などに説明することは、多くの保護者にとって大変なハードルとなる場合がありますと。日本では親自身がその役割を担うことが一般的ですが、説明の難しさや感情的な負担を感じる方も少なくありません。アメリカでは、どのように保護者の方が学校に説明したりとかしているんでしょうかという質問です。
It's a challenge here too. We actually have some regulations that say that these students should be supported, but that doesn't necessarily mean it happens. Again, it's very similar to some of the things we talked about earlier. One is bringing parents together as a common voice, because what we found, and this may be true, this may be happening there as well, is that if I go in to advocate for my child, there's sort of well, of course you think your child is brilliant. Of course you think your child is so smart, but do you have any real evidence? But when you start to put it together as here's a group of students who are all in that same space, that starts to have some value in that you can say, these kids will not succeed. Some of this really does come down to, making the case over and over and over. If you can get an outside voice, that is often, also helpful. Like that's something that we often will say, if you can find someone who can help advocate for your child, rather than the parent always having to do the advocating. That's why coming together with other parents can be very helpful, because sometimes that will lead to finding sort of an advocate for the group, who can talk about these things. We do some of this communication. We know lots of consultants who do this kind of communication. I don't know of consultants in Japan at the moment, but you have places like Education Beyond where, could be, I'm going to put you on the spot, folks at Education Beyond, but you have a group that is interested and cares and knows something about these kids. That may be something you want to try and work with as well, to start to think about how do you build a sort of a national dialogue around this. And it does take time. And that's why we try to arm parents with these other ideas so that you can try to keep your child interested, in ways that maybe the school is not able to.
ありがとうございます。だから、アメリカだからとか日本だからというよりも、保護者のネットワークっていうのがすごくサポーティブだっていうことなので、エデュケーションビヨンドのプラットフォームを軸に、今日聞いてくださってる皆さんも横につながっていけたらいいなと思いますが、はい。CTY では何か保護者のネットワークを作るために何かやっていらっしゃることっていうのがあるんですか？
So as I said, we have a CTY Facebook group. That's one way we do it. We also, through our programs, some of the parents will start to connect through their kids. So the kids will form a network, and then the parents will get to know each other as well. But we've been really impressed with the way social media has been leveraged by our community to do those things. And we do monitor that, and we'll offer advice in that space as well. We have helped parents connect to, if we know of consultants or advocates in their area, we've been able to help connect them with those as well. That's gotten harder lately, because we are so widespread. But yes, I think that pretty much everywhere, if there's just more of a voice when you have more people. The individual doesn't have as much power as the group does.
なるほど。じゃあ EB をプラットフォームにして皆様につながっていっていただきたいと思います。そして、残すところあと1問となります。日本では保護者が子供の習い事を決めて通わせているケースが、多いですと。アドバンスラーナーの好奇心を高めるためには、保護者はどのような心がけが必要となってくるのでしょうか。日本では受験ブームが過熱していて、朝から晩まで休む暇がない状態に置かれている子供も少なくないと言われていると。子供たちがバーンアウトしないために、どんなふうに保護者や教育者が心がけていけばいいでしょうかという質問になります。
That is really difficult. We've really questioned the how do you actually address being ready for things like entrance exams and such, so teaching to the test, versus encouraging curiosity, and it's tough because the goal really should be the learning and not the getting ready for a test as much as possible. Unfortunately, we're in the same boat in a lot of cases, right? Our students have to take tests, not quite the same way. We have, our public schools don't have entrance exams, and most of our kids go to those. But we do, we all have to get prepared for the state exams and the regular standardized testing, and then of course college entrance. And it's always that weird space of like, what's actually going to make the most for my child? And is it okay to kind of carve out some time for these other things? We would argue it is. We would argue that you've got to figure out a way to do some balance. And the great thing about some of these things is that downtime can be exactly those things that I was talking about tonight, right? That for kids, that often will feel like downtime. That won't feel the same. So figuring out a way, and I'd love to talk more with Education Beyond about that particular aspect of, is there a way to help families find more balance to the schedule? Because I think that burnout is very real. And it also means that most of the educational setting is probably not the setting that is tailored to an advanced learner right now. And so figuring out how to pull that in, that again will come to working with the schools as well. We do a lot of consulting lately with parents, trying to help them back down on college admissions and thinking that you've got to have this long checklist of things, and instead saying, if you can get authentic learning and build an authentic story, that's actually more valuable. We're learning that certainly in the US for getting into schools, that's much more valuable. But that's a hard lesson. It's very hard to get away from this idea that, but if I don't do these things, I won't do as well on the test. Do we know that? And it's hard. Like, do we know that you wouldn't do as well if you were doing more authentic kinds of things instead? And that's I wish I had an answer, but it's more, I think it's an opportunity to think about how we bring that balance to children's worlds more.
はい。じゃあ、これから CTY と一緒に、プログラムをやっていく EB としても、ぜひこの辺のことも一緒に協力してやっていけたらなというふうに思います。今日のプレゼント、質問への答え、大変ありがとうございました。
Thank
you,
you.
Amy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. エイミーさん、ありがとうございました。では、残す時間の中で、当団体で開催するプログラムについて、理事の小原より説明させていただきます。小原さん、お願いします。
はい、服部さん、ありがとうございます。エデュケーションビヨンドの小原佳代子と申します。今後半年に予定をしている主なプログラム2つについて、お知らせをさせていただきます。1つ目はこの2年間開催しております自由研究型プログラムビヨンドスクールです。参加者が研究テーマを決めて、その研究に伴走するチューターさんを選んで、研究を深めていくプログラムです。2年前から始めて、延べで約百数十名の小中学生の皆さんが研究をしてまいりました。2024年には、それまで短期間で、長期休暇を利用したような開催をしていたんですけれども、通期での開催を始めまして、2期目の2月期がもうすぐ始まります。次お願いします。2月期のスケジュールですけれども、チューターさんとの事前面談申し込みが昨日から始まっています。オンラインでの受講を基本としていますので、お住まいの地域にかかわらず、受講をしていただけます。募集は2月の14日まで受け付けていますので、参加をご希望になられる方は、それまでにチューターさんとの面談を終えて、正式登録をしてください。詳細はホームページにも情報を載せておりますので、ご参照いただければと思います。次お願いします。2つ目が5月上旬から12週間の予定で開催を予定しています。先ほどご講演をしてくださったエイミーさんご所属のジョン・ホプキンス大学 CTY 日本プログラムについてです。コロナ禍などもあり、検討を始めてから約3年が経ちました。大変お待たせいたしましたが、いよいよ5月に試験的にプログラムを開催することになりました。次お願いします。今回は CTY のオンラインプログラム Numbers Zero to Infinity 数0から無限を小学4年生、5年生を対象として最大20名で行います。受講方式ですけれども、アメリカから CTY の講師がオンラインで参加をし、教室では2名のバイリンガルティーチングアシスタントがサポートをするような形を取ろうと思っております。ハイブリッド方式となります。次お願いします。こちらのスライドで受講中の半日の流れを説明しています。全体では9時から12時の3時間、準備とウォーミングアップの後、1時間半ほど CTY の講師によるオンラインでの授業があり、その後休憩を挟んで、ティーチングアシスタントと、グループでのアクティビティをやったり、その日の授業の質問や宿題のサポートなどを行う予定です。次お願いします。開催日程ですが、2025年の5月の11日から7月の27日まで、毎週日曜日の午前9時から12時までを予定しています。 場所ですが、東京都内を予定しています。こちらは確定し次第お知らせをさせていただきます。毎週1、2時間ぐらいかかるですね、宿題が出るということなので、ご参加をご希望する方はその時間がかかるということをご予定ください。受講料ですけれども、12週間で26万円とさせていただいております。ご家庭の状況に応じて受講料免除の制度を設けております。詳細は団体までお問い合わせをいただければと思います。次お願いします。申し込みの要件ですけれども、通常の CTY のプログラムに参加をするための要件であります、スキャットであるとかマップテストのスコアを提出していただくか、エデュケーションビヨンドが開催している自由研究型プログラムの受講生であるということが必要となります。後者の場合、今回の CTY のプログラムにご参加いただく場合には、先ほどご紹介したビヨンドスクール2月期までのご参加が必要となります。提出いただくスコアやそれまでの研究内容などを勘案して受講者の選考をさせていただきます。応募締め切りは4月の20日を予定しております。次お願いします。プログラムへの応募や今後の情報をご希望の方は、こちらの QR コードからフォームに記載をして送付をしてください。また、ご質問などあられる場合は、こちらにあります CTY のメールアドレスにお問い合わせをいただければと思います。日本での開催は初めてのこととなります。お子様のご興味に合わせてご検討いただければ嬉しく思います。今後の EB のプログラムのご紹介は以上となります。服部さんに戻します。
はい、小原さん、ありがとうございました。では、エデュケーションビヨンドの今後の活動についてご紹介します。当団体では、Facebook や Twitter で、X ですね、活動のご報告や体験談の紹介、今後のイベントの告知などを行っています。ご覧の QR コード、もしくはチャット欄に記載している URL より遷移できますので、当団体のページのフォローをお願いします。次です。また今後の活動に活かしていくため、本日のイベントについてのアンケートにお答えいただけますでしょうか。ご覧の QR コードからリンク先に飛んでいただき、お答えいただけると大変嬉しく思います。今ちょうど残り1分時間を取りますので、ぜひアンケートへの回答をお願いします。アンケート。1分ほどで終わるアンケートですので、ぜひ皆様ご協力ください。そして本日は改めまして日曜日の朝からのご参加ありがとうございました。今後、当団体へのお問い合わせはご覧のアドレスから受け付けています。疑問点、ご不明な点があれば、ご連絡ください。すいません。アドレスが出ていませんが、ホームページの方から、お問い合わせのフォームがありますので、そちらから何か疑問やご不明な点があればご連絡ください。なお、アンケートにお答えいただいた方から、イベントはこちらで全て終了となりますので、右下の退出ボタンからご退出ください。本日はプロモのメンバーの運営で至らない点もあったかもしれませんが、これからもエデュケーションビヨンドの活動へのご理解とご支援をどうぞよろしくお願いします。本日は大変ありがとうございました。